Hi there. My name is David Yun, and I've built this podcast for all of us photographers looking for some extra inspiration. Every Friday, I interview local photographers about the how and the why behind their projects, and at the end of each episode, I add a thought or a challenge for both of us to consider as we continue our pursuit of awesome photography. You can help me keep this project growing by sharing this podcast with your photo-loving friends and by subscribing and leaving a review or a rating on your podcast platform of choice. I've also recently set up a Patreon account for those of you with the ability and interest to keep this project up and running financially. Please check out the link in the show notes. Ultimately, the goal is to stir up conversation and thoughtfulness about photography as a practice, and I wanted to start each episode with a thank you. Your attention and focus on these artists and these conversations help the community at large keep growing. So, without further ado, welcome to my viewfinder. What is your history with photography itself? What did you study? Who are you, Jen?
Who am I? Listen, I love photography. More importantly, I love art. I grew up in a home with a lot of art, and I've carried that through. I have a deep respect for photography, but it's not my formal type of study. I studied public relations at Mount Royal University, then college, and was a pretty mediocre student, but loved being in PR. And then I wanted to go into politics. That was my whole goal. I've wanted to be in politics since I was 4 years old. Yeah, you can ask me all about my love for Ronald Reagan, which now shapes how I look for a man. That's the other half of that story.
Yikes.
And then, after a little bit in private practice, I thought, I think we really got to turn it up. I felt like I'm always perpetually in an existential crisis about my life. I really was fundamentally raised to believe that, you don't create your goals and dreams find you, and you as the host have to deliver a return on investment to that. And so I went to Hopkins, and I was kind of just on fire and really did provocative work there. Wanted to stay in the United States. The US president had a different vision for that. Came back to Canada, really fell in love with this idea of how am I going to make a difference in Canada. I'm as big a champion as you're going to get for this country. I love this country. And when I see kind of where we're at with this country, I think our future generation is going to be as in love with it. And then, off to Harvard. And then this summer, I'm headed to Oxford at their request. So, I'm just kind of on this, I think my daily meditation, I'm a terrible meditator because people meditate and they ask for calm and they ask for peace and they ask for clarity and they ask for stillness. And I meditate and I'm like, how can I be the best there ever was?
Well, I think if I could counter presume, from my understanding of meditation, the more constructive one is not asking to be calm, but letting those thoughts work through you. So
exactly,
you're allowed to think.
Exactly.
Otherwise, it wouldn't work.
Well, I think you should look for balance. Look at even my relationship with Kyle. I say to him, I'm going to shoot the entire season of a podcast in 4 days. And poor Kyle's like, I'm going to have to be medicated to make it through that. And then, now we ferociously edit and then we drop it. Now, some of that is because I work in the conservative space and there's such a stigma that you have to drop everything all at once. Otherwise, you're so subject to cancel culture. So that's kind of the way that works. But anyway, so that's kind of me. I love art. I'm hunting this one piece of art. And I'm like a dog on a bone. I will not quit until I'm satisfied and I can get this piece in my home.
Okay. Yeah, just a quick tease. I don't know if Kyle actually listens to these, but when he told me he was working 4 days with you, I laughed at him because that's a lot of recording and that's a lot of work. So
yeah, it is a ton of work, and I think we never really give Kyle as much credit as we should because it's subject matter, which I know that part of it, he's like, oh, you guys are full of shit. And yet it's like Succession, it's everything. And then you have to turn the editing around. And, I'm a terrible, Kyle's always like, let the warts be in there. And I'm like, no, this. So he gets editing notes back from me and I'm pretty sure he's like, oh, I'm day drinking. I'm gonna have to buy him a lot of pie at Pie Junkie for sure.
I miss Pie Junkie. When I have disposable income and we're allowed outdoors, I'm probably gonna eat a snack. My Viewfinder is a proud member of the Alberta Podcast Network, locally grown, community supported. The Alberta Podcast Network is a program to support Albertan podcasts by connecting us with local businesses and initiatives to keep our stories and our interests at the fore. If you're interested in finding more Albertan podcast content in a wide range of topics, check out their website, albertapodcastnetwork.com, or you can connect with them over social media. They are at Alberta Podnet on both Instagram and Twitter. Our first sponsor is Shift Podcast by Alberta Innovates. Shift showcases the work being done in the province's innovation ecosystem, everything from health to clean energy. Join hosts Katie Dean and John Hagan as they interview the researchers, entrepreneurs, and businesses that are shifting our perspective about innovation in the province. In their latest episode, their guest is President and CEO of Service Credit Union. They discuss how Service Credit Union has achieved more than a modicum of success under Garth's tenure and has set a tone not only amongst credit unions, but more traditional banking institutions by achieving unprecedented success. Find Shift Podcast by Alberta Innovates on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also find it at shift.albertainnovates.ca. That's shift.albertainnovates.ca. This week, I've asked Jennifer Sanford to join me. While not a professional photographer, Jennifer is a political and PR consultant with her own podcast called Conservative Like Me. I asked her to talk to me because A, she's been a guest and collaborator on my other podcast, Kyle and Dave versus the Machine, and she's smart and well-read. And B, because she quote-unquote leans to the right politically. And as artists, we need to keep our ears open to the full spectrum of opinions. I think we'll discover today that we're not that different at all. I'm going to ask her about the use of photography and truth-forming, politics, and propaganda. We discuss the tension in the recent rise of so-called nationalism, I'm thinking MAGA, for example, and I ask the most important question. What is up with geese? They've been hissing at me on my runs, and I'm just tired of their devil-may-care attitude. Protected animal, my ass. Anyways, here's the first part of my discussion with Jen. Well, you know what? It's interesting. So you start off in PR, you're in conservative politics, you like art. So I feel like this should work for the photography podcast. Okay. But what I'm interested in is photography's position in defining reality or manipulating it, or this sort of, in my opinion, idealistic belief that photographs somehow tell us something about reality. And I don't know if in your studies you deal with anything specifically about that and the use of media.
Yeah, I do. Certainly symbols in persuasion is very important to me, and the use of art more broadly, but even the use of photographs to shape perception. A lot of people think that conservative governments are really the catalyst of using art to present their arguments, but Democrats have been equally accused of presenting information in a certain way. I'm interested to see if we're part of an important revolution or evolution, I guess, or maybe just secular iterative experience where I think in the 1940s and 1950s we really saw the use of art to rally cry. I'm thinking of, Uncle Sam Wants You. I'm thinking about Rosie the Riveter. I'm thinking about the demonstration of art to persuade people as a sense of togetherness, and how we really don't have that today. And will we see a resurgence of that? Because certainly that mechanism has been the way forward for China, right? I mean, look at their Wolf Warrior films. Those have been national films that have captured the attention of how China views itself and wants to present itself to the world. So, motion picture branding is has a lot of roots in the art world. And I'm interested to see if we will see a resurgence of that and how brands participate in that.
Yeah, it's interesting when I am certainly no historian or academic or scholar or intellectual or have any basis of having an opinion about this. But, from the onset of photography itself, it has had not just political, but certainly, it's had a bias. It's controlled by whatever powers that be. And even from the first photographs of wartime in like the 19th century, because they had cameras that couldn't take documentary pictures, they would stage battles and they would stage events.
That's right.
And it's greatly, I think the 30s and 40s were fascinating because even before World War II, there were depictions of the Great Depression to have nationalists.
Absolutely.
Right?
Weren't those photographs striking? Right? Think of the photograph of the woman, with her face shielded, with a sign that says 4 children for sale, and the 4 children are on the stoop. I mean, those images, they shaped. I think that they had a tremendous political pull because it really went on to shape, FDR and how he would go on to politic, and it really shaped, I think, the New Deal, which really, I think, we'll look back on as one of the most pivotal moments in U.S. history. I think had it not been for those striking images of men in line at the soup kitchen, men with holes in their shoes, really seeing a dilapidated America, I don't think it would have pushed the political will in the direction that it did, right? And also, at the same time, the absence of photographs. I mean, there's long been held this debate in U.S. communications of politics. If there was readily available photographs, would FDR have been the president that he was because he was in a wheelchair? And think about now the nature of how presidents are photographed. I mean, we can thank Pete Souza for that. Would we ever now have a president in a wheelchair? Because, they have to fit this one kind of mold of what people expect from their leadership.
Do you think that, from your understanding, for example, with FDR, is that a controlled decision? Because there are already photojournalists at that time. Do you think that the political mechanism has made an active and intentional decision that we are not going to promote him in a physical, like in a photograph, because he doesn't exude the physical presence of the leader of in the grand nation? Or do you think that's just unavailable?
I don't know. I don't know if it was a wag the dog, an early wag the dog moment. I don't know who the control mechanism would have been. I mean, if you think about his portrait, his presidential portrait, he is in the wheelchair, but there is a decision to put a cape around the chair to conceal the chair. I'm not sure if that would have been from his origin or a sense that it indicated a lesser position of power. I'm not sure. I mean, it was certainly no secret, but we were still in the advent of radio at that time, right? Right. I mean, his radio addresses were so poignant. That's one of the things I loved about Ronald Reagan is that the communication mechanism still mandated and warranted a tremendous communicator, balanced between scripted and unscripted, which I don't think we've seen since Reagan. Yeah, I don't know. That's a really great question. That's a really great question.
Do you think that, looking at the broad sort of evolution of, it sounds like, let's say American politics, which I'm just not versed in politics in general, but it seems to me on the outside that it's become so chaotic. And certainly with the advent of public photography and now digital photography and social media, there's just a lot of confusion. So, bringing up sort of the idolatry of let's say, president of the United States or the prime minister of Britain. And then in the last 10 years, we had Trump and Boris Johnson. And Boris Johnson's coming out with like bed head and, there's candid photographs. He
always looks, and Bernie Sanders. They always look like they just got off of an overnight flight and they don't know where their luggage is. Yeah.
So something's changed and there's always controls of stuff like that, because not like that's the candid, and then when they take a picture for their interviews, they've got it all brushed back. Do you think, what do you think is, especially with the PR angle, how has that evolved? Like what's going on with the control or the use of imagery? Is this intentional in your mind? This is all conjecture, to connect with the so-called new everyman? Or do you think this is just because we are relying on characters now because we don't have real leaders?
Well, you're absolutely right that there has been an exceptional transition away from poise and polish. There absolutely has been. And I think it's because there is a visual representation of a certain type of person representing a certain type of inertia. like political inertia. I mean, if you look at like US Congress, or even if you look at Parliament in the UK, they all sort of have a similar look. And if you can come in with another look, you can say, look, I'm actually now a visual representation of something different than what you've experienced. I think maybe they might be capitalizing on a sense of like, we know you're frustrated with the status quo, so I'm not going to sound like it and I'm not going to look like it. There also, I think, to be honest, is the rise of such a high level of male ego there that they don't care what they look like, because power is power outside of what it looks like. And I want to judge it really bad, but I'm also just jealous that that is not a paradigm that's afforded to women. I mean, like, imagine me going forward into the political space and I just have my hair in a ponytail and I don't have any makeup on and my clothes are a little bit too big for me. The only criticism that I would receive and would be captured in a photographic space would be, this person doesn't have composure and leadership. She can't lead. So there is now like a real gender divide. Like, name a female politician. Like, tell me that Jacinda Ardern can go to work looking like she just, moved from the gym. She's deeply beloved, wildly popular. I think she'll be emblematic, just like Ruth Bader Ginsburg was. But there's still the demands of a persona. So, I think part ego, part I don't give a shit. I think that's all part and parcel of it. But I think it is also creating a visual representation of, I look different and I care in a different way. I don't want to represent more of the status quo because we're done with the status quo. I think that would be my conjecture and opinion on that.
Do you think, I was thinking about how my dad told me that with immigrants, the first generation that comes in, they have to fight for recognition as less than subpar humans. But then he says it's harder for the second generation because they then have to sort of, and this is my summation, but fulfill the ideas that, so for example, my dad's like, he came in 72, Koreans are not considered, normal. And he's established himself as an architect. My mom was a teacher, but he's like, more pressure's on me because I can't go and fuck that up. So if I go out and pretend to just be like, just loose, and I am, so I'm sure he's disappointed, but there's a lot more pressure. And like you said, I'm afforded a lot more leeway as a man. But so for women, I just was thinking, how many more generations will have to pass? Because we're getting closer to civil equality somewhere, but it's such a slow grind. Maybe one day we'll get to have like a female president shows up in track pants and tells everyone to go fuck themselves. But yeah, it's just not. That's not
in my lifetime.
Yeah,
not in my lifetime. And you also forget the truths about women is that we have within us a systemic desire to compete. I feel that, and I don't want to speak for all men because if I'm a champion for intersectionality, I can't speak for all men, but I always find that in the more male form, there is a desire it's about creating a pecking order, but everybody's in it. I find too often with women, it can be like, there's only one, there can be only one, and the rest cannot be. And I don't know who I hold accountable for that. I'm thinking I just want to blame The Bachelor for that, right? Just think of the amount of television that is consumed, in North America and beyond that has women in competition with one another. And it's vicious and personal and sustained. And yet then we want to try to be all these great things in the political space. And it drives me crazy. And you even have to look at the iterative nature of feminism. The first iterations of feminism were largely white women talking about creating equality, the Equal Rights Amendment. We had some diversity in there. But now these new iterations of feminism are about saying, we need to have a greater diversity in the voices that speak for women, not one woman, especially not someone like me, a Caucasian woman or white woman, to speak for all women because our lived experiences are still different. The challenge to that is now we're starting to see that competition reemerge. Even if you look in the United States in the Women's March, those groups are eating each other alive. Well, I want to come because I'm a woman, but I also believe that abortion is wrong. Well, if you are our type of woman, you can't be part of that march then. And if you believe in, that the police does not need to be defunded, then you don't. So we're now seeing that still in our waves of feminism. And I think dialogue is important. I think we're surfacing a lot of issues, and that's important. But I also think this systemic nature of competing with one another until the other person really cannot speak and has no voice will harm our ultimate goal of, female and women represented in positions of power in a way that bring other women along. Yeah, we'll see how that sounds. That sounds so, tough it's tough to talk about it, but I think it's real. And I think, certainly organizers of women's events are encountering this.
You know what I find interesting is, especially with the current rhetoric, is with so much divide and so much, even, what do you call it? Self-consuming narratives, even within a movement. But then we also have this sort of, this counter movement of this nationalist and domestic, so MAGA, for example, this idea that there's an us and them, and we need to bring it back to us rather than acknowledge them. And you brought up this idea of status quo, and we don't necessarily have to talk about how photography itself plays a role, but I think just the projection of any image, so iconography and identification. It feels to me like it's become so complex and cannibalistic, really. Do you think that that's something that's preyed on by political parties for personal advantage, or do you think that's just something that's going on?
Yeah, I think to me, MAGA is very simple. I don't try to complicate what MAGA is. This is what I see from my own eyes, and having been in the DC environment when it was really at its full steam ahead. MAGA represents an important transition in American history. I think that's the way we'll look at it, because what it tapped into was a way of saying that a group of people who had never faced loss needed someone to tell them that loss was unnecessary. That, the industries that you work in, the factories and the manufacturing and things that will be taken away by green jobs, green innovation, and automation, that they were being heard and that progress would be stopped to ensure that transition didn't happen. And that when they looked in their communities and realized that they were, for the first time, and their many generations, a minority in their own community, as we see, rising immigration levels of, and just generational, Spanish-speaking individuals, immigrants from Puerto Rico in the coastal states, people coming from other places to experience the American dream, which I certainly would love to be part of, so I can relate. But when they look in their communities and they start to see that they're a minority, that's a change to their community. That change is a form of loss. And to have someone tap into, I see the loss that you're going through. And rather than having you feel that loss and navigate and create a new normal and create and engineer a new experience for yourself, I will stop it. And that's what MAGA is to me. And then you can apply whatever imagery you want onto it that perpetuates, I see you, I hear you, and I feel the value of what you need in a leader. That's what MAGA was. That's what Trump was. And I think it really genuinely is that simple. The problem with it now is that the leader that it was needed was a leader that could say, I say this about Erin O'Toole now. The conservative movement doesn't need someone who's going to scream at the top of their lungs in the House of Commons. They need someone who's going to hold civility and be a tremendous grief counselor to say, we need to make a pivot. We need to change. We need to come to the center of the political spectrum. It's going to be okay. I still hear you. I see you, but we got to bring you along, because if we don't bring you along, you're not going to be part of it. Worse off, you're going to breed resentment. You're going to carry that resentment as a generational gift. And then we're going to have fraction, and we're going to have, a lack of capture. So that's what I'm expecting from a conservative movement here in Canada. But in the United States, we've now seen 4 years of creating winners and losers out of absolutely every issue, and much to their detriment, much to the detriment of what Biden's going to have to do, and much to the detriment of whomever else will be the president in 3.5 years.
Do you think, from a PR standpoint and from a media relations standpoint, is this something that, a conspiratorial approach would be that this is bred, that it's intentionally stirred up to gain some economic or personal victory? But looking at the entire question, we brought up in the 40s, we have Rosie the Riveter, we have some iconic shots of people in depression. We have I can't even remember all of this. Yeah, Uncle Sam and everything coming out of that. And if we trace the evolution of art through all of the generational changes and identification, so post-war, and then we got existentialists. We got I can't remember what the revolution, civil rights movement, the hippies, disco.
Not to mention, through all of that, you have political cartoons.
Right. And so where do you think, do you think that there's a lot of control and interest there by a small power broking minority? Or do you think we're at a stage now where it's just a cacophony of everybody with their own individual interests and nobody even knows what they're talking about? Because when I'm on Twitter, that's how I feel. Like I see pictures, I see people talking. It's this echo chamber. Everybody's yelling.
Yep.
Nobody talks to each other.
Yeah, you've tapped right into it, because I think it's laziness. I think it's how hard do you want to work. This has always been my thing about the political space and the social space, is that the differences that we have between us are actually very small, and especially in this country, especially in Canada. The differences between us are millimeters. Like, we really are not, like, we have this whole spectrum to play with, but we're really not that different, right? We're really quite ideologically aligned. But what I'm seeing is conscious choices being made, and in some cases using art and photography to say, if I can just make you angry, I can turn you in the direction that I want to go. And if I can make you sad, I can engineer the type of response that I want. And I think that is the incredible shortchanging of the electorate. Something that you'll hear me say all the time is that I believe that this country's greatest resources are the intellectual contributions of its citizens. We are a smart population. We have the capability to make smart choices, to have critical thinking skills, to have critical listening skills, and to make decisions that work with us in the highest form of self-efficacy. I think we're shortchanging that self-efficacy when we say, I can get 2 tweets of information or read a political cartoon, and that'll tell me everything that I need to know so I can move on to the next thing. And I think we're seeing in certain cases the political system taking advantage of that. What I want to see is real discourse and real dialogue, especially as we've got to move people from one place to another. I mean, think about the challenges that we have ahead of us. We have real climate challenges. We've got a lot of people living in our coastal cities while sea level rise continues to be a huge issue. I think Canada is going to be ground central for human-based climate migration, something that no one's talking about, because instead we're talking about what color are you and where are you from and why can't you speak English, and I need you to tell me what your Canadian values are. Like, we're just so pivoted in the wrong direction, because I think political leadership has been derelict in their duty to say, let's have real conversations about exactly what the challenges are ahead. And I think there is an appetite for people to be brought along. I think what we're seeing is the absence of that. People looking for where they belong. And because they can't be part of discussions, because they can't engineer these discussions, they're just like, I'm going to say pithy things on social media that either get people riled up or get people thinking I'm really smart. And neither of those things move the goalpost in terms of the capability of Canada and Canadians, in my opinion.
Do you think, I mean, just thinking about the migration, it's kind of like, I was talking to Helen, and we were talking about how once in a land far, a long time ago, there was even an economic surplus in Alberta. And she's like, why didn't they build subways? And I was like, infrastructure is never sexy. Nobody gives a shit about whether they've paved the right road or anything.
That's right.
I read this article about whenever climate change turns America into a desert, Canada does become essentially potentially a fertile zone instead of a tundra, if we survive that event. And it is interesting to think about what you brought up, which is that someone in positions of power must be aware, because, these are fairly intellectual people, we presume, that hold high positions of power, but they do not seem publicly to make decisions that are outside of their 2, 4, or 8-year window. And I know, and this is the thing about propaganda, as somebody who's not in politics, I get my information from visual aids as well. So as somebody from the world within it, do you think that's a misrepresentation of leadership? Or do you think that's something that's actually happening right now, where politics, they don't see past whatever their term is, and it becomes very personal.
Yeah, there really is a movement toward the right now politician. We just saw this with Aaron O'Toole at the convention. I wanted him to come out and say, this is the mission and vision of who we are. This is like address the stigma that now associates conservatism. And instead it's like, here's the 5-point action plan. And I think we can achieve this by the summer. And we're like, I think there's more. Hey, so come on back. I think there's more. I think you got another TED Talk in you. I think there's more here. And one of the things that I would love to see a politician do, and this is why I just give wild advice, even to my employer and to the clients that I've served as a consultant, is you have to coalesce people around the plan for today and the vision for tomorrow. Because people need the assurance of, I know what keeps you up awake at night that needs to be addressed in the very short term. I know that you worry about the cost of your everyday life. You know, you worry about your job. I know that you worry about what will be in the immediate future of your kids. I hear that. I know it keeps you up awake at night. But I also know that tomorrow's challenges have to begin to be addressed today, right? We need to put together groups that leverage our best thinking. This is where we're putting resources in solving tomorrow's problems. And the political future, the political space really will say, no, we'll just give them today. And then when tomorrow arrives, we'll give them tomorrow. And that's why we see so much turnover of government, right? Like, that's why we see like this constant search of, where are we going? Sometimes the role of government is just, can I disappoint people at a rate they can tolerate? You have to have a vision for today and a plan for tomorrow. But you have to obviously say it's sexier than that. That sounds even sounds boring coming out of my mouth, and I'm a PR person. But, this is something that I brought as a thinking point to my own employer. People listening might know that I work for Ducks Unlimited Canada, and I work for them not because I overtly care about ducks. Like, I actually still don't know that much about ducks. But what I do know is that Canadians don't care about ducks, but they care about the fact that where these ducks land is the most important biodiversity, in the world. And we have to protect that biodiversity. I think that they care about the fact that we've lost 3 billion birds, like 70% of our bird population since 1970. And if we can see a decimation like that of the bird population, what about all of the other iconic animals? And of course, like wetlands, right? Like, wetlands is the business of Ducks Unlimited. And you preserve and protect wetlands and restore them. And all you do is suck carbon right into the ground. And for a country that's obsessed with carbon taxation, my God, we talk a lot about the tax and not a lot about the carbon. And that's why I'm part of an organization like that. And it's frustrating to me that why is it the nonprofit sector that's going to scale these conversations with Canadians? Like, why is it my responsibility to tell like award-winning storytelling around sea level rise? Where is the government? Because I think there is an appetite for that, but we've been starved of it for so long, we don't even know we're hungry for it. And I also think it does a great thing to low-hanging fruit, Monday morning, couch quarterbacks who, constantly want to be evaluating things, but providing no new ideas to the table. This is an opportunity for them to start to ask more critically important questions and to participate in raising the state of dialogue and discourse in this country, which I think is paramount to our well-being.
I mean, my first thought is ducks are better than geese. I don't like geese. I'm tired of geese, and I think that we should just be done with the no. Yeah.
Well, a great joke that people like to perpetuate is that earlier in my career, I worked for WestJet. I was their national spokesperson and did all the media relations. And then when I went to Ducks Unlimited, people were like, "Well, that makes sense. Like, she's gone to work for aircraft's only known predator." Terrible. That's a terrible joke. That's about human safety. I apologize.
All of this being said, what is art and media's role in this then? So, for example, you're championing discourse, rational, presumably rational, or at least civil discourse, which I think is exactly what's missing, at least in the social media sphere. My first thought was, people like Dave Suzuki or David Attenborough. Suzuki in particular in Canada is getting... he's been cast aside a little bit from all the work that he did before for whatever controversy. I can't even remember. I don't really pay attention. But, art is an interesting thing because it comes with the bias of the creator. Do you think that there's a way... with photography in particular, what I choose to take a photo of, how I choose to present it, and who I present it to can immediately become very narrow. I mean, is there a way that so PR or the use of media can be done in a conversational sense, or is it automatically by its nature kind of throwing shit at a wall, yelling at somebody, telling somebody they're wrong? I mean, what's the feeling in the real world?
Well, maybe let me actually isolate that into the PR space, because the PR profession or the PR industry has really changed the way in which they look at the use of photographs, right? There has been such a push in the last 4 years to be about diversity and inclusion. Like, do we check all the boxes in this photograph? That I think we've stopped really looking at what the photograph represents, right? Like, what are people doing in the photograph? Does the photograph connect with people, and does it have meaning? You know, you and I really share this at a fundamental level, is that I will look at a photograph, especially journalistic photos, and I really have a visceral reaction to them. And it frustrates me that we see photojournalism, you know, continue to be this provocative lens, but then when it translates into public relations where we have provocative messages, the images don't carry over. There's such an incongruence between those two things. It is so epically frustrating to me. It's not memorable. We're trying to check boxes. And I think that that's so to the disadvantage of connecting really meaningful messages with really meaningful photographs.
Is that something that's taught? Is that a structured approach?
Is it taught? Yeah, you know, I don't know. I don't know. That's a great question, Dave. I don't know. I think what I had hoped I would see is as the journalist, as the field of journalism continues to be absolutely, you know, decimated, and we see a lot of those journalists coming into the field of public relations, I had sort of thought that would be an attribute that would come with them, that would serve the benefit of the industry as a whole. I'm not sure it did. I'm not sure it did. But I also think that it comes down to, you know, adaptive leadership also. You know, sometimes we're so conscious of triggering an illicit emotion that we feel we can't then control, that we back away from images that have meaning. I mean, look at after 9/11, you know, Falling Man took 10 years to be publicly viewed and accepted as a part of the 9/11 narrative, because there was a real feeling that it violated these small rules of what could be presented and what couldn't. I feel the same way about images from Syria. When I see the photographic work of journalists, of correspondents in those areas, I'm struck at the poignance of what's really happening in Syria. I have a photo on my desk of two small children crouched in a corner, and they can't be older than probably 5 and 3. And he has his little hands over top of her ears to protect her from the sound. And the look on their face is gutting. It's gutting. It raises this question about, you may not be able to identify Syria on a map. You may not understand the military and political and social conflict of Syria. You may not care, but everyone who has a heart for a child would be deeply moved. And then the question becomes, how does that image translate? Then you look at organizations that are doing on the ground work with Syria. What do they do with an image like that? Because it's a conversation starter. But you can't put that in any communication medium. You can't put it on a website. You can't put it on a brochure, because it does two things. One, the image becomes so repelling that you have such a visceral reaction that you can't participate in it, because we really do repel from images like that because they're so hard to look at. And the second thing is, you can be easily accused of disaster capitalism, right? Using those images for gain. And so it really is an important public relations conversation to be having in our profession. I wish we were having it to a greater degree, is what do we do with this visual representation? Because, you know, we need to see those images, and we need to see those images as a mechanism to how we tell stories. So long as the communications profession is seen as, you know, something that is for gain and not something that helps to rise the level of discourse and participate in my larger goal of heightened discourse in this country, I think a lot about what we do with those types of images. Look at Vietnam. Look at those images of the end of Vietnam. That was such an important emblem of the way in which international or a US conflict could end, right? There's no victory. There were no people kissing in Times Square. There was people running to helicopters as fast as they can, and a group of Vietnamese people being left behind. And those images are striking and form an important part of how we tell history. I mean, we talk a lot. Okay, now I'm taking over, Dave. We talk a lot about how history can be retold, but images hold us accountable. They hold us very accountable to history as it existed. And for that reason, I think it's vitally important.
As you know, because you've been a guest twice, Kyle and I have this movie podcast, but now that we're doing movies in 1971, we're learning about just how controlled media has been historically.
Yes.
And so I just read an essay, not for the movie, but essentially for prep for this, about an interesting thought, exactly as you bring up. So what happened in Vietnam that we got very anti-war, I don't know necessarily anti-American, but these visceral images. But in World War II, Allies and the so-called Axis, they were carpet bombing everybody. I mean, there are a lot of children on fire. There's a lot of just despicable things. I was reading an actor, he was an intelligence officer, and he's got a description of what it was like to walk into one of the first concentration camps. And I almost threw up just reading the text. And I think, like you said, people weren't ready in a sense. I mean, this becomes a judgmental to assume that people are too naive or unable to digest these things. But I mean, if I came to a stranger on the street and asked them if they wanted to look at a picture of human beings piled on top of each other, they were liquefying, I think everybody would say no, presumably. There's an element of political control in maybe not what the photographer necessarily wants to take a picture of, but what, like you said, what gets disseminated into the public realm. And is there a sense like that there are specific groups that are in control of how that gets put out? I mean, in the old school journalism, it was always the editor of a newspaper would say, well, this is even if the photographer hated this one image, like this is the one that tells a story that goes along with this text. I go, what's going on recently? I don't know. I don't even know this
as
story.
media becomes more partisan, you're starting to see images being selected to fuel that narrative of partisanship. Plus, media consumption is also, a fundamental business now. It's about ratings and viewers and subscribers and, showing them images that they don't want to see, but perhaps they should. That's not good business. That's not them looking at like, what is my moral obligation to tell this story? They're looking at how can I make this something that people can easily amplify, right? Like you and I might read an article about, what really happened with the liquefaction of Jews and other groups in World War II. And we find it incredibly, provocative and gut wrenching and, a story that's worth being told, especially when we think about like the Uyghurs in China undergoing an incredible act of just total genocide. We might think, this needs to be shared, but, people are going to get that and say like, I need more Meghan Markle content in my life. That's where I'm at. And so there's what should be occurring, and then there's what is occurring, and then you have partisanship pulled right over top of that as a nice cozy little blanket to tuck them in. But I think it's important to look at how a political, you mentioned it earlier on Vietnam, how a political environment shapes the imagery out of it. And I think that looking in the United States at World War II versus Vietnam is such a great example of that. Because in World War II, it was like, look at the art, like Rosie the Riveter, we talked about, Uncle Sam, like all of the like fight, like we need you for your country and send us your medal. And it was really about coalescing a national effort of, this happened in Pearl Harbor and we're not going to let this happen in our borders, and we're joining the fight and we're going to liberate Europe, and look at us go and wave our flag. And you see the image is really representative of that, representative of I'm part of the effort. Vietnam was so not so. Vietnam surfaced issues of tremendous inequality. I mean, if you were well-to-do, you were able to dodge the draft. You were able to get, a letter. But if you had nothing and you lived in parts of the country that had nothing, and you were a generation that had nothing, you all of a sudden found yourself fighting in the jungle in a country you couldn't identify on a map. These were largely disproportionately young Black men. And, the sheer deception and the shape of that violence, it was incredibly uncivilized war. And it just felt never ending. And at a certain point, that, whole collections of people would be sitting around with their rations saying, what is the point of this? I'm not even sure what the ultimate goal is of this. I just want to go home. I want to go home to Mississippi and Louisiana and Georgia and the places, where my mom and dad are from, and try to create a new normal. And when they went home, like, my God, were they ever not served well? I mean, Vietnam veterans represent exactly how America failed its citizens. And that's just a well-known fact. And you see that manifested in the imagery of the faces of these men coming home, of pictures now of men with veteran Vietnam veteran hats on, looking much older than they really are. And you see the embedding of war correspondents trying very hard to tell these stories, to say, let me remind you that no son of a member of the Senate is fighting in Vietnam. And I think those stories help to really coalesce this issue of the hippie movement, of nonviolence, of people saying, I'm going to go to Washington, I'm going to represent a peace and love generation, and I'm going to hold this government to account. So, I think that photography has such a great ability, and photographers, behind it have a great ability to really surface what's going on and tell those stories. I mean, there's no ability now to go back to Vietnam and go, oh, wasn't that bad, and people loved the fight, and they were no. You see the images of, I love that one image of the mail. It's just a mailbox, and the mailbox is open, and there's letters all over the ground, and there's a young Black man sitting against the mailbox, and he's holding his draft letter. And the poignantness of what that war was doing to those segments of the population. I mean, you can't retell history with that kind of photography that supports those moments.
This week's sponsor is the Calgary Foundation, proudly supporting community needs for 65 years. Everyone wants to feel a sense of belonging. Now, more than ever, we are united by a desire to take action and help others by creating a community built on kindness and compassion. From small creative projects to larger citizen-led initiatives, the Calgary Foundation provides grassroots grants to encourage and support people who want to create and strengthen bonds between neighbors and communities. If you've got an idea to improve, enhance, or revitalize your community or neighborhood, visit calgaryfoundation.org to find out more about the Foundation's grant opportunities, and visit Calgary Foundation's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube channel. Okay, so part 1 is in the books, and I feel like this has been a great conversation starter. We've learned so much, starting with Jennifer's obvious passion for art and photography and her keen awareness of its role in shaping public information. We've talked about 2 wars, the systematic defining of how women interact with each other, the problem of nationalist sentiment, and how it actually is a symptom of resistance to change. We've brought up the danger of social media and its inherent appeal to a lack of broad discourse and creating echo chambers. And we've asked about art and photography's role in all of this. I don't think we have answers. They're just broad concerns that are generational, perhaps. But there are also a lot of talking points here. For our part, I wonder how aware each of us must be about our own narratives and beliefs of how the world is and ought to be. Or perhaps it's better to not focus on that so much as to look for the humility to engage in conversations on those values, including seeking out contrary opinions so that in the long run and broader scale, the conversation itself can become culture forming. Are we trying too hard to impact the world as individuals, using a single viral tweet and amassing followers and likes? Or should we be reading and partaking in information that comes with citation and some balanced research? Again, I'm ending this with a lot of rhetoric without a single-minded purpose, but in the last few years particularly, I think these questions are necessary. Intellectual conflict is not new. It's part of the human experience to disagree with each other. I think the question is, how do we disagree constructively instead of devolving into yelling matches, or, at its worst, into another war? At the risk of negating all of these thoughts, I just want to finish by saying stay safe out there. Wear your fucking mask, sign up for a vaccine, let's get past this pandemic so that we can have these conversations in person, whether we're sitting in coffee shops or presenting them on a stage in front of hundreds of people. Let's work together so we can help broaden the discourse the world needs to keep adapting for the better, whatever that means. Do you have a bucket? Are you a bucket list person other than trying to find Ronald Reagan? But
I am an aggressive vision board maker and curator. It's like I am big about it. Like at the top of my bucket list professionally would be, I would love to go to an organization like the UN and work for the World Food Program. Food insecurity was such an important part of my mother's upbringing, that to see that even in this time on this planet, we still have people who suffer from food deserts and food insecurity and food instability and nutritional instability. It's just unconscionable to me. And so to leverage the skills that I've learned to be able to contribute in that space. I'd love to work for Bill and Melinda Gates is the other one. I think that they're doing such pioneering work. And when I think about innovation and communications playing a role in innovation, man, would I ever be lucky to land there. But to be fair, at the very top of my bucket list is something very personal to me, and it's going to Italy. And the reason, I know it seems so simple, like book a trip and go to Italy, but I got doing this thing in my 20s where I felt I had to earn it. I felt like I had to earn it. So I went to college and I didn't go then because I was like, no, I want to be the super studious. And then I was into my career and I was like, oh, if I do really good in my career, like I'll earn a trip to Italy. And then it was, then I got married and I was like, oh, if I can prove myself to be a super good wife, we'll go to Italy. And then, that doesn't work out. And you're like, well, maybe when I reinvigorate something. And I've always been asking for permission. Like, think of the things I've done, Hopkins, Harvard, Oxford, and I'm still asking for permission to go to Italy. Like, I'm still trying to earn it. So this is it. And I had the perfect window to go pre-COVID, like the perfect window. And I was like, no, I want to wait until I'm like, this entirely different person? I'm not sure. Like I always think of, now I'm digressing, but did you ever see that skit with Adam Sandler about being an Italy tour guide?
No.
And he's like, so when Adam Sandler came back to SNL, he did this tour guide thing. And he said like, we're happy to take you to Italy, but we just want to tell you that the you that you are today is still going to be the you that you are when you go to Italy. Like, it's important that you remember, like, this, it's the same you that's going to go there. So we can, take you on a hike, but we cannot make you the person that likes to go hiking. And we can take your picture, but it's still going to be the you that you are in that picture. So, like, we can give you wine, but we can't control who you become when you drink that wine. And I think that maybe that's what Italy represents to me is it my best self that's going to go? And I know that people listening are probably just like, are you kidding? Like, just book a ticket and go. Like, what is so hard? But it's always at the center of my vision board. It's always this, like, I gotta go. COVID has made it very painful to think about, like, but now I have to go. Like, this is the thing. Have me back on and to ask me about my trip to Italy. And if I haven't, I would like the rest of the episode to just be you shaming me about it. Like, what is the problem?
Well,
what is the problem?
It'll be your post-COVID treat. We should just, if Italy still exists after all of this stuff.
If Italy still, man, haven't they been